Night fell on April 6, 1862, with Ulysses Grant sheltering beneath an oak tree near Pittsburgh Landing, soaked through by rain that had been coming down since sundown. His army had spent 14 hours being driven backward across the Tennessee countryside. His headquarters tent had been converted by surgeons who needed the space, and the sound coming from inside it was the sound of men on tables in the dark. He could not sleep there. He could not go anywhere near it. So he stood in the rain, under a tree, with a bruised ankle from a horse that had fallen on him earlier in the day, trying to make sense of what had happened to his army. What had happened was close to a military catastrophe. The Army of the Tennessee had been caught entirely off guard that morning by a Confederate assault that hit with a force and violence no one on the Union side was prepared to receive. Division after division had been driven from its camps, from its breakfast fires, from positions it had barely located before Confederate soldiers were inside them. Thousands of Union troops had broken and run, and by evening somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 of them had gathered at the riverbank at Pittsburgh Landing, refusing to fight, beyond the reach of officers who tried threats and pleas in equal measure. The Tennessee River was behind them. An enemy army that had spent the day learning just how far it could push was somewhere out in the dark ahead. William Sherman found Grant under that tree late in the night. Sherman had his own wounds from the day, his hand had been hit, 2 horses killed beneath him, and he had seen enough in the past 14 hours that he came to suggest withdrawal across the river was probably the necessary call. He started to say something in that direction. Grant stopped him. "Lick 'em tomorrow." That exchange, 4 words long, contained something essential about Grant that Shiloh exposed and the rest of the war confirmed. But the question of what Shiloh revealed about Grant is secondary to the prior question, the one that makes those 2 days in April worth examining, which is what Shiloh revealed about the war itself, and about what 2 untested armies could do to each other when they collided without restraint across the same patch of Tennessee woodland. When the fighting began in 1861, the controlling belief on both sides was that it would be short. A decisive engagement or 2, and the losing side would accept the reality of its position and negotiate. First Bull Run in July of 1861 had complicated that belief without dismantling it. The Union loss was alarming, but it was explained as a product of bad coordination, premature movement, the specific conditions of one particular afternoon. The assumption that the war could still be resolved quickly, at a cost the country could metabolize, survive Bull Run more or less intact. People revised their timelines without revising the fundamental framework. Shiloh demolished the framework. Albert Sidney Johnston commanded the Confederate force that descended on Grant's encampments on the morning of April 6. Jefferson Davis regarded Johnston as the finest military mind in the Confederacy, possibly in the country. And Davis's confidence in him was such that the string of Western disasters the Confederate cause had absorbed through the winter of 1861–62 were accepted without serious political consequence, because Davis believed Johnston was building toward something that would change everything. Fort Henry had fallen to Union gunboats in February. Fort Donelson had surrendered 2 weeks later, costing the Confederacy more than 12,000 soldiers. Nashville had been yielded without a fight, the first Confederate state capital to fall. Johnston had retreated south to Corinth, Mississippi, ceding Kentucky and most of Tennessee, and Davis had defended him publicly because he believed the retreat was calculated, not desperate. What Johnston was building toward was a single decisive blow. His plan required hitting Grant before Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio could arrive from Nashville to reinforce him. Grant's army was encamped near a Methodist church called Shiloh, along the west bank of the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing, positioned with the assumption that the Confederates were weeks away from being ready to mount any offensive. Johnston had concentrated approximately 44,000 men at Corinth. Grant's force of roughly 42,000, many of them regiments that had never fired at an enemy, was the target. Buell was approaching with an additional 30,000. Johnston's window to find Grant alone was closing, and he knew it. The night before the assault, Johnston told his staff what victory at Shiloh would accomplish. "Tonight," he said, "we will water our horses in the Tennessee River." The Confederate army moved out of Corinth on April 3. The approach took 3 days, delayed by mud, by confusion in the column, and by the near impossibility of moving 44,000 men quietly through terrain they didn't know. Beauregard, Johnston's second-in-command, pushed more than once to call the attack off. The delays had been long enough, he argued, that surprise was gone, and attacking an alerted enemy was tactically different from attacking one that didn't know you were coming. Johnston rejected this each time and pushed forward. Grant's army had no warning that registered. Union pickets who reported unusual sounds from the tree line in the days before the assault had their reports minimized or stopped before they reached senior commanders. Grant himself was 7 miles away at his headquarters in Savannah, Tennessee, on the night of April 5. The Army's senior leadership had settled into a collective assumption, not reckless by the standards of available information, but catastrophically wrong, that Johnston's army was not capable of attacking and that any Confederate movement in their direction was exploratory rather than offensive. They believed they were safer than they were, and the morning of April 6 arrived with that belief still intact. At just after 5 in the morning, Confederate infantry stepped out of the tree line. What happened in the opening hours was a collapse that operated at a speed the Union forces couldn't respond. Entire regiments, some of them in uniform for less than 3 months, were eating breakfast when Confederate soldiers entered their camps with weapons firing. Men grabbed rifles and tried to form lines while their tents burned behind them. Officers attempted to establish positions as their units dissolved in real time. The sound of the assault, the artillery and the rifles in combination, across a front that stretched nearly 3 miles, produced a noise that survivors described as a physical force, something that struck the body as well as the ears, constant and disorienting in a way that made rational thought genuinely difficult. Regiments went from breakfast to close-quarters combat in minutes, and a great many of them could not hold. The Confederate advance rolled through 3 successive Union encampments in the morning hours. Ground taken, briefly contested and then given up, was covered in the debris of camps abandoned in panic, food still on fires, letters to families half-written, equipment scattered in patterns that showed which direction the men had run. The Union left and center retreated under sustained pressure. The right flank, where Benjamin Prentice's division had been drilling when the attack struck, held somewhat longer. Prentice managed to form his men before they broke, and he fell back to a position along a sunken farm road that would define the day's fighting. The road itself offered modest physical cover, a shallow depression, with dense scrub brush along its front. Prentice assembled his division there, along with fragments of W.H.L. Wallace's division that had been driven back to the same ground, and he held. What the Confederate brigade sent against that position over the next 6+ hours encountered is where the battle's most recognizable name originated. The sound of thousands of rifle rounds passing through the air at close range produces a buzzing, high-pitched quality that men who have heard it compare to exactly one thing. The soldiers at the sunken road called their position the Hornet's Nest. It has been called that ever since. Confederate brigades attacked the Hornet's Nest in a sequence that military historians count at 11 or 12 separate assaults, depending on how individual attacks are defined. Each one crossed open ground to reach the sunken road and the undergrowth that shielded the defenders. Each one absorbed the fire of infantry behind cover, which is among the most asymmetric exchanges in conventional warfare. The defenders steady, aimed, protected. The attackers exposed, moving, dying before they reached the range at which they could return effective fire. The Confederate losses on that open ground, across those repeated assaults, were severe in a way that the attackers could not fully sustain indefinitely. What the Hornet's Nest purchased, at the cost of the men holding it, was time. Every hour Prentice held the sunken road was an hour Grant used to build a final defensive line at Pittsburgh Landing, to position nearly 50 artillery pieces on the bluff above the river, to bring the gunboats USS Lexington and USS Tyler into range, to sort the organized survivors from the broken regiments and put them back into a line that could actually stop the Confederate advance if it reached the riverbank. Albert Sidney Johnston was killed during the afternoon fighting, not at the Hornet's Nest but in the area of a peach orchard on the Confederate right flank, in full bloom that morning, the white and pink blossoms drifting down through the gun smoke and settling on men in the grass beneath them. Johnston had been leading from the front, moving among his troops in a way that most army commanders avoided. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, a rifle ball struck him behind the right knee, cutting the popliteal artery. He mentioned nothing about it, continuing to direct the assault for another quarter hour before blood loss dropped him unconscious in the saddle. He bled to death from a wound that a tourniquet, applied immediately, would almost certainly have controlled. His personal physician had been sent away earlier in the afternoon to treat Confederate wounded farther down the line, an act of generosity that removed the one man nearby with the training to recognize what the wound to the leg actually meant. By the time aides discovered the extent of the bleeding, Johnston was beyond saving. He was the highest-ranking officer killed in action during the entire Civil War, on either side, and he died. At the moment his army's assault had its deepest penetration. Command passed to Beauregard. Confederate General Daniel Ruggles, stalled in front of the Hornet's Nest through the mid-afternoon, eventually assembled 62 artillery pieces into a concentrated battery against the position, the largest single mass of artillery in a Western theater engagement to that point in the war. The bombardment ran for roughly half an hour. When it lifted, the Confederate infantry went forward again, and this time the flanks of the Union position had been turned enough that the assault succeeded. Prentice, with enemy soldiers on 3 sides and his ammunition Running out, surrendered approximately 2,200 men at around 5:30 in the afternoon. W.H.L. Wallace was mortally wounded trying to break out of the encirclement. The Hornet's Nest had absorbed and slowed the Confederate attack for 6 hours. The ground in front of the sunken road, when the shooting stopped, documented what those hours had cost the men who had crossed it. The final Confederate push toward Pittsburgh Landing in the late afternoon ran into the defensive line Grant had built while Prentiss was buying time. The artillery on the bluff and the gunboats on the river together produced a volume of fire that the Confederate units, tired from a full day of fighting through dense woodland, reduced in strength, without Johnston, could not push through. Beauregard assessed what remained of the day's light and the condition of his troops and stopped the attack. He sent a telegram to Jefferson Davis announcing a complete Confederate victory and planned to finish the battle when morning came. He did not know that Buell's Army of the Ohio had been crossing the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing throughout the afternoon and evening. He did not know that Lew Wallace's Union division, lost for most of the day after taking the wrong march route, had finally arrived at the landing. By the time darkness was complete, Grant's force was larger than it had been when April 6 began. The ground between the two armies that night was something soldiers who endured it carried for the rest of their lives. Rain came down hard and cold. The wounded were everywhere, in the creek bottoms, in the spaces between trees, in the fields and the orchards and the trampled camps. The screaming of men and horses in the aftermath of a Civil War battle was standard in kind but not in scale at Shiloh. Thousands of wounded lay in the rain through the night with no shelter, no treatment, no one coming for them until morning. Many did not survive to see it. Near the center of the first day's battlefield sat a small pond. Through the night, wounded men from both armies crawled to it and drank from it, and enough blood from enough wounds drained into the water that by morning the pond had changed color in a way that gave it the name soldiers assigned it without discussion. Bloody Pond. It is still marked by that name on maps of the battlefield. Grant moved through the dark getting his attack order settled for the following morning. He had made his decision before Sherman arrived at the oak tree, and everything he did through the night was in service of it. Sherman later said that something clarified for him that night regarding Grant, not recklessness, not false confidence, but a quality he could not quite name until he had watched it operate across another 3 years of war. Grant's orientation was always toward the next thing that needed doing. The previous day's losses were information, not argument. On the morning of April 7th, the Union Army attacked. Buell's fresh divisions struck the Confederate left with force the exhausted Southern troops could not match. Grant's reorganized units pushed back across the ground that had been lost the day before. The Confederate Army, without Johnston, without the momentum and surprise of the first morning, without the reserves to absorb the pressure of a fresh army on its flank, gave ground steadily. Beauregard ordered a retreat toward Corinth. The withdrawal became disorganized as the hours passed and the Union pressure continued. By early afternoon, the ground was back in Federal hands. Grant chose not to pursue aggressively when the Confederate Army fell back, a decision historians have examined at length. His force was exhausted and its organization had been badly disrupted across 2 days. Whatever the reasoning, the Confederate Army reached Corinth battered but intact, and Johnston's vision of destroying Grant's force and driving it into the river went unrealized in either direction. When the casualty figures were compiled, they produced a kind of national paralysis. The Union had lost approximately 13,000 men across the 2 days. Confederate losses came to approximately 10,700. Together, nearly 24,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured at a place most of the country had never heard of before April. At that point in the war, combined Shiloh casualties exceeded the total American combat deaths from the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War added together. Newspapers across the North and South did not have adequate language for what those numbers meant. The vocabulary of the war, the frameworks ordinary people had been using to understand and contextualize what was happening, had been built on assumptions that Shiloh dissolved in 48 hours. Grant spent the weeks after Shiloh in a state of effective suspension. Henry Halleck, his superior, moved to take personal command in the field in a way that removed Grant from meaningful authority, citing the lack of preparation that had allowed the Confederate surprise on April 6. Lincoln faced calls to remove Grant entirely. His position, reduced to various summaries over the years, held to one line: he couldn't afford to lose a man who fought. Grant was eventually restored to command, and the man who went back to work after Shiloh was operating from a different understanding of the war than the one he had held on April 5. He wrote years later that before Shiloh he had carried the assumption that a beaten Confederate army would recognize the futility of continuing and seek terms. Shiloh broke that assumption past repair. What replaced it was the recognition that the South would fight to complete depletion, that winning the war required not a decisive stroke but the kind of sustained, grinding, unyielding pressure that would eventually leave the Confederacy with nothing left to resist with. He was almost alone in that understanding among Union commanders. In April of 1862. By 1865, it had become the strategy that ended the war. The soldiers who came through Shiloh on both sides brought it back with them in a form that distinguished them from men who had only read about it. The accounts left by veterans of those 2 days return, across decades of memoirs and pension letters and regimental histories, to the same specific images. The tree line coming alive on the morning of April 6, the sound of the hornet's nest at its height, the peach blossoms on the ground among the dead, the cold rain, and the voices in the dark. These details recur with a frequency that indicates they never fully settled into the past. Men who went on to fight at Chickamauga and in the Petersburg trenches still trace certain things back to that Tennessee woodland in the first week of April 1862, as though Shiloh was the place where the war became fully itself, and everything after was a continuation of what started there. What started there was the war in its actual form, stripped of the timelines and casualty assumptions and clean resolution that both sides had carried into 1862. Shiloh did not simply produce a Union victory and a Confederate strategic failure, though it produced both. It forced on every person who encountered it, soldiers, commanders, families reading casualty lists in newspapers, politicians accounting for the numbers, the knowledge that this conflict operated on a scale and with a brutality that no previous American war had approached, and that it would continue to operate that way until one side had nothing left. The army that left Shiloh was not the army that arrived. The men who had slept in those camps on the night of April 5, who woke to the sound of Confederate artillery opening in the gray morning, who held or ran or tried to do both, they were not the same soldiers 4 days later. They had been inside something that reshaped them in ways that drill and training and patriotic speeches had not predicted and could not have produced. They understood what the war was. Shiloh made sure of that. Thank you for watching. Please do well on sharing our work so others can watch and learn. Also like and subscribe.